So, we're looking at the life of Sophie Charlotte of Bavaria. It's a really turbulent story, from her engagement to King Ludwig II through years of, well, internal turmoil, and ending with that tragic, heroic act at the Bazaar de la Charité fire.
A compelling story, absolutely. But that framework, it sets things up nicely. But we need to make sure her early life does more than just provide context.
You're right. It needs to establish the central, tragic tension of her whole existence right from the start.
Exactly. The material as it is effectively outlines her life, but that core tension, between her incredibly unconventional upbringing and the rigid demands of the court, that needs to be the absolute driver of the narrative. It should dictate everything for the next 30 years.
Right now, the source mentions those conflicting influences. Her liberal father, Duke Max, against her very duty-driven mother, Ludovica. But it's just presented as background detail.
It needs to be the friction. The main critique here, I think, is that this clash has to become the primary psychological pressure point. It's what explains her later sort of impulsive decisions.
So that initial freedom she had at Possenhofen, it doesn't just fail to prepare her, it spectacularly backfires when she faces those institutional constraints.
I mean, that's the logic, but do we risk maybe blaming her free upbringing for the trauma she goes through if we overemphasize Duke Max's liberalism as the source of her failure?
That's a fair point, a crucial distinction. The goal isn't to blame the freedom itself.
Okay.
But to show how completely ill-equipped it made her for the reality of her social standing. So the suggestion is to reframe those early chapters. They shouldn't just be biography.
They should be more of a critical analysis.
Exactly. A critical analysis of failed autonomy, showing how that unconventional start made her fundamentally incapable of making the compromises she needed to make.
That framing makes the beginning feel predictive, It shows that the very thing that made her so interesting, her individualism, was the exact reason she couldn't survive inside that system.
Yes. And to do that, we need concrete, really vivid examples of that conflict.
Okay, so for instance,
we could heighten it by highlighting Duke Max's passions, his liberal politics, the circus, folk music, all of it. Frame that as the direct source of the individualism that just clashes so violently with the court's expectations.
And you'd see that play out during the public scandal of the broken engagement with Ludwig.
Precisely. It's not just that she was different. Her difference, which came from her father, was politically unacceptable, an embarrassment to the monarchy.
And then, to really drive home that sense of loss, you contrast the freedom of Possenhofen, the lake, all that unstructured time, with the immediate crushing claustrophobia of court life right after.
Her mother, Ludovica, frantic to forget the insult, just instantly pushes her into this arranged marriage with Ferdinand d'Alençon.
It's the speed of it. You show how quickly that illusion of freedom is just snatched away the second duty rears its head. It establishes the central paradox of her life.
She was a product of the aristocracy who was, structurally unable to benefit from it without destroying herself.
That level of internal conflict is the perfect setup for what comes next.
Which brings us to that long, quiet middle section of her life. This is where so many biographical narratives can, lose their momentum.
It's a real structural challenge to stop that affair with Dr. Glaser, which happens 2 decades later, from seeming like this, isolated, late-life breakdown.
Right. We need to establish a stronger psychological thread, one that connects that initial trauma in 1867 to her eventual mental collapse.
The weakness here is pretty significant. The marriage to Ferdinand from 68 to 86, it risks feeling like a lull, a chronological waiting game.
We're told she has depression, this internal unrest, but we don't really feel the cumulative toll of it all.
So her sudden decision to seek a divorce for a commoner 20 years later feels, it feels like it comes out of nowhere. It lacks the proper preparation.
We have to move beyond just saying she was depressed. The reader needs to feel that entrapment. So the suggestion, I think, is to really deepen the depiction of her internal life during those years in exile.
In England and Vincennes.
Right. and frame that recurring depression made worse by the English climate, the darkness surrounding her, not just as an illness, but as the slow, grinding psychological cost of forced submission.
It's the cost of compromise. Her body is essentially rejecting the life that's been imposed on her. And if we frame it that way, we can use the evidence about her need for escape more strategically.
That is the key. You give more weight to her health issues and how her husband wisely arranged those summer trips back to Bavaria.
So it shows the pattern.
It's a crucial detail. It shows she was reliant on escaping that imposed life long before the final break. She physically needed to retreat to the landscape of her youth just to survive her marriage.
It makes her behavior understandable, not just random. And that buildup lets us maximize the impact of what happens in 1886. That year has to be the pivot point.
It absolutely has to be. We can use that confluence of events. First, the death of her ex-fiancé Ludwig II, and then immediately after, her own severe illness, scarlet fever and diphtheria.
It's a dual shock. The loss of this defining figure from her past, plus a near-death experience of her own.
It provides the emotional logic for what follows, for the desperate affair with Dr. Glaser, for her declaring she could no longer live without this man.
So the affair is elevated from, say, a midlife impulse to a desperate, maybe even manic bid for self-preservation. It's justified by 2 decades of suppression and this sudden, stark realization that life is short.
She had to break out of the cage, and the shock of 1886 gave her the catalyst.
And that gives the whole middle section the dramatic trajectory it needs. The Glaser affair stops being an arbitrary event.
And becomes the logical, if tragic, culmination of the trauma from 20 years before. We've shown the initial damage and then built the tension all the way to that breaking point.
Okay, so that fixes the middle. Now, what about the end of her life? The material handles the heroism of the fire really well, but we need to make sure the years leading up to it really maximize the poignancy of that final act.
The final act is powerful for sure, but there's a risk that the narrative of her later life, especially after she's released from the asylum, could feel a bit passive.
That is a very sharp observation. The narrative mentions her joining the Dominican Third Order and learning to submit again.
Right. And that emphasis on submission, it risks making her final years seem like a retreat, like she's gone back to being passive, which sort of undermines the incredible strength she shows in her last moments.
I agree. If her final act is this huge moment of self-definition, of choice, then the time leading up to it can't be defined by submission. So the suggestion here is to reinterpret her dedication to charity.
Specifically, Le Bazaar de la Charité.
Exactly. Reframe it as her final successful act of personal self-discovery, something she found very late in life.
So it's not a passive devotion to religion. It's a determined escape from the uselessness of aristocratic life. She's replacing that hollow court duty with a genuine active social purpose.
That shift allows us to see her as finally defining herself on her own terms, separate from her family, separate from her husband.
To do that, we have to give more weight to the specific secular focus of her charity work. We need to highlight her work with post-war social problems in France, war victims, poor children, orphans.
It shows a practical, engaged choice, not just to retreat into prayer. She actively chose to be useful in a world where she was supposed to be purely decorative.
This changes everything about her final moments.
It does. It contrasts the destructive individualism of her youth with a kind of constructive individuality in her old age. We can draw this incredibly powerful line between the public scandal of the broken engagement,
which destroyed her reputation,
in the absolute clarity of her final redemptive moment, where she puts everyone else before herself.
It brings the whole narrative full circle. The initial failure of autonomy gives way to a lifetime of struggle, which culminates in this one, final, definitive autonomous choice that completely redefines her legacy. She died with purpose.
And to really land that ending with the most power, the narrative has to emphasize her final recorded words.
Go quickly. Don't worry about me. I will be the last to leave.
That deliberate heroism, it's the ultimate expression of the agency we've been working to establish. It links her death back to the assessment that she died in the service of others, not as a queen or ruler, but as a human being.
That final choice is the emotional payoff for decades of struggle. It unifies her whole seemingly disparate life into a single, powerful, tragic conclusion. This has been a really insightful critique. The material submitted is already quite strong, but these high-level edits will, I think, elevate it from a good biography into a truly profound historical tragedy.
So, to quickly recap the main actionable takeaways. First, really exploit that paradox of freedom versus constraint from her upbringing. Make it drive the initial dramatic tension.
Second, deepen that psychological bridge across the 2 decades of her marriage. Show the cumulative cost of her submission to really justify that later breakdown.
And third, reframe her final years of charity not as submission, but as an active, conscious form of agency and self-discovery. That will maximize the tragic heroism of her death.
These are structural enhancements, really. They're designed to maximize the reader's emotional experience. We really encourage you to implement these changes and submit the revised material back to us for another critique. We look forward to seeing it.